Homeless teen finds a mysterious letter. What he discovers changes everything. The wind cut through Ethan Carter's thin jacket like a knife, making him pull it tighter around his body. It was early December, and New York City had turned into a giant freezer. His breath came out in puffs of white as he walked along the empty sidewalks, searching for a place to rest. The night was quiet, except for the occasional car passing by, its headlights sweeping over the cracked pavement. Ethan was used to the cold by now. He had been on the streets for nearly a year, long enough to learn which places offered the best shelter, where to find food, and how to avoid trouble. He had stayed in a few homeless shelters before, but they were always full of loud, desperate people. Some were kind, but others stole or picked fights. Ethan preferred to be alone. He stopped in front of a small corner store, pressing his numb fingers to his mouth and breathing on them for warmth. The store's bright lights and warm glow looked inviting, but he knew better than to go inside. The last time he had tried to linger in a store just to warm up, the owner had yelled at him and threatened to call the police. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten much that day, just a granola bar he had found half crushed in his backpack. He had learned to stretch his food, eating just enough to keep going but never enough to feel full. Hunger was something he had made peace with. Ethan glanced across the street at the small city park. It wasn't much. A few benches, some trees with their bare branches reaching toward the sky, and a frozen fountain in the middle. It wasn't the best place to sleep, but it was quiet. As he walked toward the park, his boots crunched against the frozen ground. He had found the boots a few months ago in a donation bin outside a thrift store. They were too big, but at least they kept his feet from freezing. Ethan picked a bench near the fountain, one that was hidden enough to keep him out of sight, but still allowed him to see the street. He sat down, rubbing his hands together and stuffing them into his pockets. He had learned to sleep sitting up. It made it easier to wake up quickly if someone tried to bother him. He pulled out his old backpack, his most valuable possession. It held everything he owned: an extra pair of socks, a worn-out hoodie, a small flashlight, and a pocket knife he had found in an alleyway. At the very bottom of the bag, wrapped in a plastic bag to keep it dry, was a folded picture of his mother. Ethan swallowed hard. He hadn't looked at the picture in weeks. It was too painful. His mother had been the only person who had ever cared about him. She had worked long hours as a nurse, trying to make a better life for both of them. But when she got sick, everything changed. The hospital bills piled up, and the little apartment they had called home was taken away. When she passed away, Ethan had nowhere to go. Foster care was supposed to be the solution, but it had only made things worse. His foster home had been nothing like the warm, welcoming place he had imagined. His foster parents barely paid attention to him, only caring about the check they got for taking him in. And the other kids? They were cruel, always looking for someone to pick on. One night, after his foster father had come home drunk and angry, Ethan decided he had had enough. He packed his bag, took a few dollars from the kitchen counter, and left. He had been on his own ever since. A gust of wind shook the trees, making Ethan shiver. He curled up tighter on the bench, trying to ignore the ache in his stomach and the stiffness in his limbs. Just as he was about to close his eyes, something caught his attention. A small white envelope sat on the bench beside him, as if someone had left it there on purpose. Ethan frowned. It was strange. Who would leave a letter on a bench in the middle of the night? He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The paper was slightly worn, as if it had been sitting there for a while, but the name on the front was still clear: Eleanor. There was no address, no last name, just Eleanor. Ethan hesitated. His first instinct was to toss it aside. It wasn't his business. But something about it made him pause. The envelope was sealed, but not with tape or glue. It was simply folded shut, as if waiting for someone to open it. Curiosity got the best of him. Slowly, he unfolded the letter and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was neat but slightly shaky, as if written by someone who was nervous. Eleanor, I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I have to try. I made a terrible mistake, and I've spent every day since regretting it. I should have been there when you needed me the most. I should have never left. I am so sorry. If you can ever find it in your heart to forgive me, I'd like to see you again. I need to see you again. Please, if you're willing, come to the place where we last spoke. I'll be waiting. James. Ethan read the letter twice, then a third time. Who was James? And what had he done that needed forgiveness? He looked around, as if expecting someone to come running back for the letter, but the park was empty. The street beyond it was quiet. Whoever had left the letter was long gone. For a moment, Ethan considered just leaving it there. It wasn't his problem, but something about it nagged at him. Maybe it was the way the words felt heavy with regret, or maybe it was because he knew what it was like to want forgiveness for something that couldn't be undone. Either way, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was supposed to do something with this letter. With a sigh, he folded it back up and tucked it into his backpack. Maybe tomorrow he'd try to find out who Eleanor was. Or maybe he'd just forget about it. Either way, tonight the letter was his. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he wasn't completely alone. Ethan woke up to the sound of car horns and the distant chatter of morning commuters. The city was coming to life around him, but he felt like he had barely slept. His back ached from the cold, hard bench, and his fingers were stiff from the winter air. He rubbed his hands together and blew on them, trying to get some warmth back into his body. The letter was still in his backpack. For a moment, he considered tossing it in the nearest trash can and forgetting about it. It wasn't his problem. He had enough to deal with. Finding food, keeping warm, staying safe. But as he stared at the folded paper tucked between his things, something inside him told him not to let it go. With a sigh, he slung his backpack over his shoulder and started walking. He had no idea where to begin. The letter only mentioned the place where we last spoke, but that didn't help much. New York was huge, and there were a million places two people could have met for the last time. His stomach growled as he passed a coffee shop, the smell of fresh bread and hot coffee making his hunger worse. He pressed a hand against his empty stomach and kept moving. A few blocks down, he spotted an old bookstore squeezed between two taller buildings. It looked out of place, like something from another time. The sign above the door read Graham's Books, and the window display was filled with old, worn books. Ethan stopped. Bookstores were warm, and if the owner was nice, maybe he could sit inside for a little while. He wasn't planning on stealing anything, just resting, maybe flipping through a book, so he didn't look suspicious. He pushed open the door, and a small bell jingled above him. The inside was even cozier than he expected. Wooden shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with books of all sizes and colors. A reading nook with two armchairs sat by a fireplace that wasn't lit, but the space still felt warm. The smell of paper and ink filled the air. Behind the counter stood an old man, probably in his late 60s, with silver hair and round glasses that made him look like he belonged in one of the books he sold. He glanced up from the newspaper he was reading and gave Ethan a quick once-over. "Morning," the man said, his voice deep and calm. "Looking for something in particular?" Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to people talking to him like a regular person. Most store owners ignored him, or worse, looked at him like he was about to steal something. Just looking," he mumbled, keeping his hands in his pockets. The old man nodded and went back to his newspaper, not pressing him for more. Ethan wandered through the shelves, running his fingers along the spines of books he knew he'd never be able to buy. He stopped at a section labeled History and picked up a book at random. He wasn't actually interested in reading it, but holding it made him feel like he had a reason to be there. As he flipped through the pages, his backpack shifted, and the letter inside made a soft crinkling sound. He froze, then carefully reached inside and pulled it out. James and Eleanor. His thumb ran over the edge of the paper. Should he ask? The old man seemed to know a lot about books and history. Maybe he had heard the names before, or maybe he'd think Ethan was crazy for asking. Ethan took a breath and walked back to the counter. "Hey, I found this letter," he said, placing it on the counter. The old man raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything right away. He unfolded the letter and read it slowly, his eyes scanning each line with deep focus. When he was done, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the wood. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "On a bench," Ethan said, Last night, the old man let out a low hum, his gaze distant. James and Eleanor. I haven't heard those names in a long time. Ethan's stomach flipped. So he did know something. Do you know them? Ethan asked, trying to sound casual. The man nodded. Eleanor used to run a shelter for homeless kids. Back in the 80s. It was one of the only places where kids on the street could get a hot meal and a safe place to sleep. He sighed. But she disappeared years ago. No one knows what happened to her. Ethan frowned. And James? Her brother, the man said, adjusting his glasses. But they had a falling out a long time ago. He left, and no one ever saw him again. Ethan looked down at the letter. So, what do you think this means? The old man studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide something. Then he reached under the counter and pulled out a thermos. He poured some steaming coffee into a small cup and slid it toward Ethan. Ethan blinked at it. For me? He asked, unsure if this was a trick. The old man nodded. You look like you could use something warm. Ethan hesitated, then picked up the cup, letting the heat seep into his fingers. He took a small sip, the bitter taste filling his mouth, but he didn't care. It was warm, and that was enough. What's your name, kid? Ethan. The old man nodded. I'm Mr. Graham. Ethan glanced down at the letter again. Do you think Eleanor might still be out there? Mr. Graham was quiet for a moment. Then he sighed. If she is, she'd be in her late 70s by now. But if James wrote this letter, that means he regretted what he did. Maybe he tried to find her. Ethan traced a finger over the inked words. He didn't know why he cared so much about a letter that wasn't his. Maybe it was because he understood regret. I think I want to find out, Ethan admitted, where she went. If she ever read this. Mr. Graham studied him again, then gave a small nod. All right, I'll help you. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. You will? Mr. Graham shrugged. I don't believe in coincidences. If that letter found its way to you, maybe it's for a reason. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Hope. Ethan sat in the back corner of Graham's bookstore, staring at the letter in front of him. The words felt heavier now, knowing that they belonged to real people. Eleanor wasn't just a name on a page. She had been a person who ran a shelter for kids like him. And James, whoever he was, had walked away from her only to regret it years later. But regret didn't change anything. Ethan knew that better than anyone. Mr. Graham sat across from him, sipping coffee from an old ceramic mug. He didn't say much, just watched Ethan with the quiet patience of someone who was used to waiting. So, Graham finally said, setting his mug down. What's the plan? Ethan hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. I don't know, he admitted. I don't even know where to start. Graham leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. Well, we know a few things. We know Eleanor used to run a shelter. We know she had a falling out with James. And we know that at some point she disappeared. Ethan nodded. Right. So, Graham continued, if we're going to find out what happened to her, the best place to start is where she used to be. Ethan frowned. You mean the shelter? Graham nodded. If we can find out where it was, maybe someone still remembers her. That made sense. But Ethan wasn't used to investigating things. He was used to running away, not digging deeper. Still, something about the letter made him want to keep going. Do you know where it was? Ethan asked. Graham sighed. It's been a long time, but I think it was somewhere in the East Village. I remember hearing about it back in the day. The East Village, that wasn't too far. Ethan glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost noon. If he left now, he could probably get there by early afternoon. I'll go check it out, Ethan said, standing up. Graham raised an eyebrow. By yourself? Ethan shrugged. I've been by myself for a long time. Graham studied him for a moment, then sighed. At least take this. He reached into the cash register and pulled out a $10 bill, sliding it across the table. Ethan stared at it. I don't need... Take it, Graham said firmly. Get yourself something to eat while you're out. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to people just giving him things. But he also knew he wouldn't find a better offer, and his stomach was already growling. "Fine," he muttered, grabbing the money and stuffing it in his pocket. Graham just shook his head with a small smile. "Be careful, kid." The East Village was busy, even in the cold. People bustled along the sidewalks, bundled up in thick coats and scarves, their breath visible in the crisp air. Ethan kept his hands in his pockets as he walked, his eyes scanning the street signs. He didn't know exactly where the shelter had been, but if it had been a big part of the community, someone had to remember it. His first stop was a small convenience store on the corner of Avenue B. An old man stood behind the counter, reading a newspaper. He barely looked up as Ethan approached. "Hey," Ethan said, trying to sound casual. "Do you know if there used to be a homeless shelter around here? Maybe, like, a long time ago?" The old man squinted at him. "Shelter? Yeah, it was run by a woman named Eleanor." The man frowned, setting down his newspaper. "Eleanor, huh?" He scratched his chin. "Yeah, I remember her, real nice lady. Used to run the place a couple blocks down, but it's been gone for years now." Ethan's heart sped up. He was on the right track. "What happened to it?" The old man shrugged. "City shut it down, said the building wasn't safe anymore. I heard she tried to fight it, but she didn't have the money to keep it going." Ethan swallowed. That didn't tell him much about where she had gone, but it was something. "Do you know where she went after that?" The old man shook his head. "No idea. She just disappeared. Some people said she left the city. Others said she just gave up." He sighed. "Sad story, really. She helped a lot of people." Ethan nodded, his fingers tightening in his pockets. "Thanks," he muttered, before heading back outside. He stood on the sidewalk, staring at the spot where the shelter used to be. It was just another empty lot now, surrounded by a rusted fence and covered in old posters. The city had erased it, like it had never existed. Ethan knew that feeling. He turned to leave, but a voice stopped him. "Hey, kid." He turned back. The old man was standing in the doorway, watching him. "If you really want to know about Eleanor," he said, "there's an old guy who runs a soup kitchen a few blocks over. Name's Clarence. He knew her better than most." Ethan nodded. "Thanks." He started walking, his heart pounding in his chest. This was more than just a letter now. He had to find out what happened. The soup kitchen was tucked between two larger buildings, the faded sign above the door reading St. Anthony's Community Meals. A group of people huddled near the entrance, waiting for lunch to be served. Ethan hesitated before stepping inside. The smell of warm food hit him immediately. Fresh bread, hot soup, something with spices that made his stomach tighten painfully. Behind the counter, a tall, older man with dark skin and gray hair was ladling soup into bowls. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp and kind. Ethan waited until the line had thinned before walking up. "Are you Clarence?" he asked. The man glanced at him, then nodded. "Who's asking?" Ethan swallowed. "I heard you knew Eleanor. She used to run a shelter around here." Clarence froze, his ladle hovering over the pot. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, slowly, he set the ladle down and turned to face Ethan fully. "Why do you want to know about Eleanor?" Ethan hesitated. He didn't know how to explain. He didn't want to tell this stranger about the letter or about how he had found it. I found something that belonged to her," Ethan finally said. "I want to know what happened to her." Clarence studied him, his expression unreadable. "You ain't a cop," he finally said. "And you don't look like no journalist." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not." Clarence nodded slowly. "All right, I'll tell you what I know." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "But first," Clarence said, "you gotta eat something. You look like you haven't had a real meal in a while." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but his stomach growled loudly, betraying him. Clarence chuckled and handed him a bowl of soup. "Sit down, kid," he said. "This is gonna take a while." Ethan sat at a worn wooden table in the corner of St. Anthony's soup kitchen, his hands wrapped around a warm bowl of soup. It was the first real meal he'd had in days, and though his instinct was to eat quickly, he forced himself to slow down. He didn't want to look desperate, even if he was. Across from him, Clarence leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. His sharp eyes never left Ethan, studying him carefully. Ethan had met enough people on the streets to know when someone was deciding whether to trust him or not. "So," Clarence said, breaking the silence, "tell me what you really want to know." Ethan hesitated. He could just lie, make up some excuse, and leave. It wasn't like he owed Clarence anything. But something about the old man's steady gaze made him feel like it was safe to tell the truth. "I found a letter," Ethan admitted, pulling it from his backpack. "It's from someone named James. He wrote it to Eleanor." Clarence's expression shifted. He reached out, taking the letter carefully, as if it were something fragile. As his eyes scanned the words, his face darkened. "James," Clarence muttered under his breath. "Haven't heard that name in a long time." Ethan leaned forward. "Who was he?" Clarence sighed, setting the letter down. "Eleanor's brother. She used to talk about him sometimes, but never with much warmth. They had a falling out. Bad one. She stayed in the city, built something real for herself. He ran away." Ethan felt a strange twist in his stomach. The story felt too familiar. Clarence continued, his voice quieter now. "Eleanor was tough. She built that shelter from nothing and helped kids who had nowhere to go. But life wore her down. When the city shut her place down, she lost everything." Ethan swallowed hard. "And then?" Clarence shook his head. "She disappeared." Ethan's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "I mean, she walked away and never came back." Clarence's face was lined with something like guilt. "I tried to find her. A lot of us did, but it was like she just gave up." Ethan sat back, his mind spinning. This wasn't what he wanted to hear. He had pictured something different. Eleanor fighting back, proving everyone wrong. Not this. Not a woman who had helped so many people, just giving up. Clarence sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, kid, I get why you're curious, but sometimes the past is just the past. Maybe Eleanor doesn't want to be found." Ethan clenched his fists. "But what if she does?" Clarence looked at him for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "There's one place you might check," he said. "An old retirement home in Queens. A couple years back, I heard someone mention a woman who sounded a lot like Eleanor. I never followed up." Ethan's pulse quickened. This was it. He grabbed his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder. "What's it called?" "Rosewood Senior Living," Clarence said, shaking his head. "But listen, kid, if she's still there, don't expect some big reunion. People change." Ethan nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. He didn't know what he expected. Maybe an old woman who had been waiting all these years for someone to find her. Maybe a bitter stranger who didn't want to talk. But there was only one way to find out. It took Ethan almost an hour to reach the retirement home. The bus ride was long, and every minute that passed made his anxiety worse. He didn't know why this mattered so much to him. Maybe because it wasn't just about Eleanor anymore. Maybe it was because he knew what it felt like to be abandoned. Maybe, deep down, he wanted to believe that no one truly disappeared. When he finally arrived, Rosewood Senior Living wasn't what he expected. It wasn't fancy, but it wasn't falling apart either. The brick building sat on a quiet street, the front lined with bare trees and a few benches. A couple of older residents sat outside, wrapped in thick coats against the cold. Ethan hesitated. He had come all this way. If he walked away now, he'd never know. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The lobby was warm, filled with the scent of old books and coffee. A woman in a beige sweater sat behind the front desk, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She looked up when he approached. "Can I help you?" Ethan cleared his throat. "I'm looking for someone. Eleanor. I don't know her last name." The woman's brow furrowed. "We have several residents named Eleanor. Do you know anything else about her?" Ethan hesitated. "She used to run a shelter. A long time ago." The woman's expression changed. She glanced toward a hallway leading to the back of the building. "You mean Eleanor Parker?" she asked softly. Ethan's breath caught. That was her. The woman gave him a careful look. "Are you family?" Ethan thought about the letter in his pocket, thought about James who had left her behind. "No," he admitted. "But I need to see her." The woman studied him for a long moment. Then, with a small nod, she stood up. "Follow me." Ethan's heart pounded as he followed her down the hallway. The walls were lined with framed photos, smiling residents, holiday decorations, faded memories of a place that tried to feel like home. They stopped in front of a door near the end of the hall. "She doesn't get many visitors," the woman said quietly. "Be kind." Ethan swallowed and nodded. Then, slowly, he knocked. The door opened a few inches, and for a moment all Ethan could see was the edge of a wooden cane. Then, the door swung wider, revealing a woman in her late 70s, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun. Her eyes were sharp, even behind her glasses. She studied him, her expression unreadable. "Yes?" Ethan hesitated, his fingers curled around the letter in his pocket. "My name's Ethan," he said. I found something that belongs to you." Eleanor frowned. "Belongs to me?" Ethan swallowed, then slowly pulled out the letter. Eleanor's breath caught. She reached for it with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the words. Ethan watched as something flickered across her face. Something deep, something painful. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. "James," she whispered. Ethan shifted on his feet. "I don't know if he ever sent it, I found it." Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, closing her eyes. For a long time, she didn't speak. Then, finally, she lowered her hand and looked at Ethan again. "Thank you," she said softly. Ethan nodded, unsure of what else to say. Then, to his surprise, Eleanor gestured to the chair beside her. "Would you like to sit?" Ethan hesitated. Then, slowly, he stepped inside. As he sat down, he realized something. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't running away. Ethan sat stiffly in the small, sunlit room, unsure of what to say. Eleanor Parker was nothing like he had imagined. He had expected someone weak, frail, weighed down by time and regret. Instead, she sat tall in her chair, her sharp blue eyes scanning the letter over and over, as if she was trying to make sure it was real. Minutes passed in silence, only broken by the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. Ethan shifted in his seat. He wasn't used to sitting in places like this, places that felt safe, where the walls weren't closing in on him. The room smelled like lavender and old books. A framed photograph of a young woman with dark hair, laughing at something beyond the camera's view, sat on the nightstand. Ethan recognized her immediately. It was Eleanor Younger's younger brother, unreported, unmistakable. Finally, Eleanor placed the letter down on her lap and let out a shaky breath. "I never thought I'd see this again," she said softly. Ethan hesitated. "So, James really was your brother?" Eleanor nodded, her gaze distant. "Yes, my younger brother. We were close once." She exhaled deeply, leaning back in her chair. "But life pulled us apart. He made mistakes, and I made my own." Ethan watched her carefully. "What happened?" For a moment, Eleanor didn't answer. Then, with a small, sad smile, she picked up the letter again, running her fingers over the creases. "He left," she finally said. "Just packed up and disappeared one day. No warning, no goodbye. I tried to be angry, but mostly I was hurt." She looked up at Ethan. "Have you ever been left behind?" Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He wasn't sure why, but the way she asked made it impossible to lie. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. Eleanor studied him for a long moment before nodding. "It changes you, doesn't it?" Ethan nodded, staring at the floor. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Eleanor sighed. By the time James tried to come back, it was too late. "I had already lost the shelter. I had lost everything." Ethan's head snapped up. "So it's true? You really ran a shelter?" Eleanor smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "I tried," she said. "For years, I tried to make it a safe place for kids who had nowhere else to go." She paused. "Kids like you." Ethan tensed. "I never said I was—" "You didn't have to." Eleanor's voice was gentle. "I know the look of someone who spent too much time surviving instead of living." Ethan swallowed hard. He didn't like talking about himself, but something about Eleanor made it hard to stay silent. "You really help people?" he asked after a moment. Eleanor nodded. "I did, or at least I tried." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then why did you stop?" Eleanor's eyes darkened. "Because I lost hope." Ethan frowned. "But what?" Eleanor's fingers tightened around the letter. "When the shelter was shut down, I fought. I tried everything, but the city didn't care. Money talked, and I didn't have enough of it. One by one, the kids I was trying to protect disappeared. Some found help elsewhere. Others..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "I don't know what happened to most of them." Ethan felt a pit form in his stomach. He had seen what happened to kids who had nowhere to go. Some made it out, others didn't. "So you just walked away?" he asked before he could stop himself. Eleanor flinched. It was the first time she had shown anything close to guilt. "I told myself there was nothing left to fight for," she admitted. "That maybe I had done enough." Ethan stared at her, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he had expected. But he hadn't expected this. Because the truth was, he had thought the same thing once. Hadn't he given up too? Hadn't he walked away from a life he didn't think was worth fighting for anymore? And yet, somehow, he was still here. Ethan took a deep breath. What if it wasn't too late? Eleanor looked at him sharply. "What? What if it's not over?" Ethan pressed on. "What if you could still help?" Eleanor let out a small bitter laugh. "Help who?" Ethan clenched his fists. "Me." Eleanor's expression shifted. Something unreadable flickered in her gaze. "You?" Ethan nodded. His heart was pounding, but he didn't stop. "You had a shelter, right? You knew how to help kids like me. So help me," he swallowed. "Help me figure out what I'm supposed to do next. Because I sure as hell don't know." Eleanor studied him for a long time. Then finally, she smiled. "You remind me of someone I used to know," she murmured. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Eleanor shook her head. "No." She paused. "Me." Ethan blinked. Before he could say anything, Eleanor sat up straighter. "All right, kid. You want help? Then here's my first lesson." Ethan leaned forward, waiting. "You don't have to do it alone." Ethan frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Eleanor said, "that I may be old, but I still have a few connections. And I know someone who might be able to help." Ethan hesitated. "Who?" Eleanor's lips twitched into a knowing smile. "Clarence." Ethan's eyes widened. "Wait, you know Clarence?" Eleanor let out a soft chuckle. "Of course I do. He was one of the first kids my shelter ever helped." Ethan sat back, stunned. This whole time Clarence had known Eleanor, and he never said a word? Eleanor's gaze turned serious. "If you're really ready to figure out what's next, you should talk to him again." Ethan exhaled slowly, nodding. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't lost. Maybe, just maybe, he had found someone who actually cared. Later that evening, as Ethan left the retirement home, the city lights glowed around him. The air was cold, but he barely felt it. For months, he had been drifting. Now, for the first time, he had somewhere to go. Clarence had fed him, Graham had given him warmth, and Eleanor had given him something he hadn't even realized he needed. Hope. Maybe kindness wasn't just something that other people gave away. Maybe it was something that could come back to you. Maybe it was something you could build a life on. Ethan took a deep breath and started walking. Tomorrow he will go back to Clarence's soup kitchen. Tomorrow he will take the next step. Tomorrow he will finally stop running. The next morning, Ethan stood outside St. Anthony's Community Meals, staring at the chipped wooden door. The same door he had walked through yesterday, hungry and uncertain. But today, something felt different. Yesterday he came looking for answers. Today, he was here for something else. A second chance. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The warm scent of bread and coffee filled the air. Inside, the soup kitchen was already busy. Volunteers bustled behind the counter, pouring steaming bowls of soup and handing out sandwiches. People sat at the long cafeteria-style tables, eating, talking, or simply resting from the cold. And at the center of it all was Clarence. The old man stood behind the counter, ladling soup into bowls with the same steady movements Ethan had watched the day before. But when Clarence looked up and spotted Ethan standing near the doorway, his hands stilled for just a second. Then he gave a small nod. "Didn't think I'd see you back so soon," Clarence said as Ethan approached. Ethan shrugged, shifting his weight. "Yeah, well, I had a conversation with someone." Clarence raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Eleanor?" The ladle slipped from Clarence's fingers, clattering into the soup pot. For the first time since Ethan had met him, Clarence looked truly surprised. "You found her?" Ethan nodded. "She's at a retirement home in Queens. Rosewood Senior Living." Clarence let out a low breath, shaking his head. "Well, I'll be damned." "She remembers you," Ethan added. "She said you were one of the first kids her shelter ever helped." Clarence let out a short laugh, rubbing his chin. "That was a long time ago." Ethan hesitated. "She also said, you might be able to help me." Clarence looked at him carefully. "Help you how?" Ethan swallowed. "I don't know exactly. But I know I don't want to keep doing what I've been doing." He glanced around at the people in the soup kitchen. "I don't want to be stuck." Clarence studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he sighed. "All right, kid, are you serious about this?" Ethan nodded. Clarence reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He scribbled something down, then handed it to Ethan. "That's the address of a youth program I work with," Clarence said. "They help kids who want to get off the streets, housing, job training, GED prep, stuff like that." Ethan stared at the paper. This was it, the thing he had been searching for without even realizing it. A way out, a way forward. Ethan folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket. "Thanks." Clarence nodded, then gestured toward the counter. "Now, if you really want to start over, how about earning your first meal? We could use an extra set of hands." Ethan hesitated, but only for a moment. Then, slowly, he stepped behind the counter. Clarence handed him a ladle. "All right, kid, let's see if you can serve soup without spilling it everywhere." Ethan let out a small laugh, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't forced. Ethan stood in front of a small mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt. It was the nicest thing he had worn in years. Just a simple button-up and jeans, but clean. He had his own place now. Nothing fancy, just a small, shared apartment provided by the youth program. But it had walls, a bed, and a door that locked. And for the first time in a long time, he had a future. He had been taking GED prep classes for the past 2 months, and according to his teacher, he was ahead of schedule. He had picked up a part-time job working at a bookstore, Graham's Books, of course, where the old man pretended to be grumpy about hiring him, but secretly gave him extra reading materials for free. And today he was going to see Eleanor, again. It had been weeks since their first meeting. He had visited her a couple of times, but today was different. Today she invited him for lunch. As he stepped out of his apartment, the cold air hit him, but he didn't mind. The city felt less lonely now. By the time he reached Rosewood Senior Living, his heart was pounding in his chest. The receptionist recognized him this time and smiled as she waved him through. "She's been expecting you." Ethan walked down the now familiar hallway and knocked on Eleanor's door. "Come in," came her voice from inside. He pushed the door open and stopped in surprise. There, sitting beside Eleanor, was Clarence. The old man smirked at Ethan's shocked expression. "What? You didn't think I'd let you be the only one catching up with old ghosts, did you?" Ethan let out a small laugh and stepped inside. Eleanor smiled warmly. "It's good to see you, Ethan." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, you too." As he sat down at the small table, Eleanor poured him a cup of tea, just like she had done for Clarence. "You've changed," she said after a moment, studying him carefully. Ethan glanced down at his hands. "I don't know. Maybe." Clarence chuckled. "Nah, kid, you have..." Eleanor smiled. And I think James would have been proud. Ethan looked up sharply. He hadn't thought about James much since finding the letter. But now, as he sat in this room with two people who had helped shape him in ways he didn't even understand yet, he realized something. James had left Eleanor behind, but Ethan had made a different choice. He hadn't walked away, and maybe that was what really mattered. 1 year later, Ethan adjusted his tie, his fingers slightly shaky. He still wasn't used to dressing up. The community center was buzzing with energy. Tables were set up, volunteers moved back and forth, and at the front of the room, a small podium waited. Ethan still couldn't believe they wanted him to speak. He had been working at the youth shelter for 6 months now, helping kids who had been exactly where he had once been. Kids who thought they had no future. He had started out just cleaning and organizing donations, but then Clarence had thrown him into mentoring, telling him he had a way of getting kids to listen. And now he was standing in front of a crowd, about to tell his story. Eleanor and Clarence sat in the front row, beaming at him. Graham was beside them, pretending to look unimpressed but clapping anyway. Ethan took a deep breath, stepped up to the microphone, and began. "A year ago, I was sleeping on a park bench," he said. "I had nothing. No home, no future, no reason to believe anything would change." He looked out at the faces watching him, some young, some old, some who needed to hear this. But one small act of kindness changed everything. He smiled at Eleanor, and then at Clarence. "And now, I want to pass that kindness on." The room filled with applause, and for the first time in his life, Ethan felt whole.